that the chat function and the Q&A will be available for you to use. So I'd just like to now invite any of our attendees to just do a quick introduction of themselves into the chat, just so we can see who we've got here and everybody can just get to know each other a little bit. What I would advise is please don't put any questions into the chat box, please put them all into the Q&A box, because if any questions do go into the chat box, we won't be picking them up. With the questions that go into the chat box, if you see one that you like, there is the functionality within the Q&A box to actually be able to upvote questions, and we will be prioritising questions that get the most upvotes. So please do upvote any questions that you think or you would like to hear answered by the panellists. We're going to aim to get through as many questions as we possibly can during the webinar, but obviously we do have limited time, so please do keep adding questions as we go through to any of the panellists, because they will be able to answer some of them as it goes on. So without further ado, I'll get on to kind of a bit of an introduction as to why we wanted to put a session on about ecosystems in balance tonight. So after the Second World War, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that the focus of agricultural policy really was on food production and getting the most out of the land available. And this focus on food production and the advances that we saw during the agricultural technology during the Green Revolution has meant that conventional farming systems have typically relied heavily on artificial inputs to achieve the high levels of productivity that we see. And farmers have usually been able to achieve the yields that they have through advances in crop breeding and the use of fertilizers and pesticides for controlling or managing competition from pests, weeds and diseases. But over the last few years, we've been seeing more and more issues with the UK agricultural industry's high reliance on these external inputs. Just thinking about the war in Ukraine and the volatility that we saw due to that within the raw material markets and the huge increases that we saw in prices of fertilizer. We've also seen some significant plant protection product losses over the last few years, and we're also seeing increasing levels of resistance to plant protection products, for example in blackgrass and cabbage stem flea beetle, which are impacting how effective those products are in terms of management for on-farm pests. So what we're really now seeing is that we need to change the way that we're managing on-farm pests. And there's also growing evidence which is highlighting that our current reliance on these plant protection products is having major consequences for biodiversity, the wider environment and also public health. So this actually risks undermining our food security, profitability and productivity in the long term. What we also are aware of is that biodiversity actually has a critical role to play in supporting food production, as it provides several free services, from pollination to pest control to providing healthy fertile soils. So the webinar this evening, we're hoping to highlight some of the techniques you can implement on farm to successfully manage crop pests and also improve the biodiversity on your farm. So tonight, hopefully, without any more technical issues, you'll hear from two farmers who are currently using whole farm system approaches on their farms and the benefits that they're seeing from using these systems to manage pests, weeds and diseases. And then also we'll hopefully be hearing from a representative at BugLife about the measures that you can take to improve and establish habitat for beneficial insects. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Martin Lines. Martin is a farmer and contractor in South Cambridgeshire, growing mainly arable crops on his family farm and rented land. He has a special interest in farm conservation management, currently running an ELS and HLS agreement, and has countryside stewardship schemes on land he rents and manages. He also supports the delivery of stewardship schemes for a number of other farmers. Martin is also the NFFN UK Steering Group Chair, sharing best practices and demonstrating what can be accomplished for nature and the environment while producing great produce.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction. I believe, Lossie, you're going to share the slides for me.
Yes, I'm just going to get the slides up for you now.
Lovely, thank you very much. That saves me trying to do it from my side. So my name is Martin Lyons. I farm in Cambridgeshire. we are a predominantly arable system, but we're transitioning our approach in what we do. And I put the title up there, nature-based integrated pest management, because integrated pest management as an individual tool, it doesn't deliver the whole picture of what you really need to do. And as farmers, we are running businesses, so we've got to really work for our bottom line. But it also increasingly recognise we need to work for the environment as well. We have the next slide then, please. So on our own farm, we've been into various stewardship schemes for over 20 years. The original schemes were really just buffering watercourses, replacing some hedgerows, and a very simple approach to adding income streams to the farm and buffering off the edges. The more we got into those schemes and started to realise the benefits, the more ambitious we became. And in our previous scheme that we've just finished for the last 10 years, that was a HLS and ELS scheme, and we could take out the less productive areas. So you see the two maps there of the shaded side of woods, the awkward corners, squaring up bits of fields, and really starting to see the link of delivering those habitats that improve for biodiversity. So we're increasing bird numbers, increasing pollinators, but that was also starting to make my thinking change as we deliver those. And I welcomed more people to come and count species on our farm and actually start to value the services they can deliver on our farm. Next slide, please. So within the package of options we did on our farm of bird seed mixes and buffer zones, we put a whole range of these pollen and nectar marges that interconnected our farm from one side to the other using watercourses and hedgerows to join the farm landscape up. And these are just a range of the different, what they look like at different times of the year. And well, the bottom left-hand picture there, you can see a bumblebee in there, or it's a bee of some sort. These were actually stuffed full of insects. And then, of course, the birds came in to eat the insects, and that ecosystem of life started to evolve, but I hadn't really noticed it. And it's only by welcoming people in who are counting different species they were finding that opened my eyes, and then I started questioning what are we delivering and how. In the top left-hand picture there is a field with a margin, and in the top corner there on the left is a field of winter wheat. 9 years ago, or nearly 10 years ago now, that field was winter beans. And in the spring, we had black bean aphid. About this time of year, an aphid came in and traditionally would be decimate, or we believed would decimate the winter beans. The traditional practice would add another insecticide on, because I'm not an organic farm, add another insecticide on and spray those aphids off. And I used to work with my father and an agronomist who tells us which chemicals we should be using. They were telling me, well, I've got to get out there and spray that. So they wrote the recommendation, sent the chemical in. Unfortunately back then, it was wet and windy for about 10 days. I was unable to get out there with the pesticide, with that insecticide to kill those aphids. And I had my father on my back saying, I've lost the crop because I haven't been quick enough to react and apply that product. What I could see was actually when we eventually got the weather window to go and apply, when I went out there before I'd mixed the chemical up, what I found was most of the beans didn't have any aphids left on there at all. What we found was they were full of ladybirds, lacewings and other things eating the aphids. And the nearest they were to the margin, there was almost completely gone. At the other end of the field, there were still some, but the beneficiaries were coming in. So what we managed to do, I decided that I wasn't going to apply that insecticide. I couldn't see the point. I had a discussion with my father. He wasn't really keen on that idea, but we saw no impact yield. And from that day forward, for the last 9 years, we've used no insecticides across the farm. And we haven't seen any great hit to any yields, but we've seen that ecosystem really develop. On the next slide, please. So in our schemes now, we're trying to deliver that interconnecting landscape right across our farm and really focusing around year-round beneficiaries and insects, and what do they need and how do their life cycle work. So we have grass margins we leave unmown and interconnecting flower margins. We put some strips in the fields, and the hedgerows are my vertical flower margins during the spring and summer, and they host my predatory species during the winter. Next slide, please. So we've been undertaking a number of trials to try and understand the real benefit of this. And we were growing spring beans, and we've welcomed the PGRO to come and do some investigations of how does it work. So within our margins that were legume rich of lucernes and various things, you'll see the image on the left-hand side. We were farm A. Farm B was a farm doing a whole farm approach, but occasionally used some insecticide. Farm C was a standard edge-to-edge farming. We only had 6% weevil damage in the spring, compared with a conventional farm that was suffering 23% damage, and they were using insecticide. And then when we come to sell the beans, we only had 11% damage within the beans, because we can sell that for human consumption. And the conventional farm had got 23%, and their produce didn't make human consumption spec, so they lost out on premium around 60 to 80 pounds. So by me not applying an insecticide, we had a healthier crop that's withstood the pressure of pests. And the image on the right-hand side, and again, we're farm A, the orange sections are the biodiversity, the beneficiaries, and the blue bits are the pests. And on our farm, the data they collected, and they've run this scheme as test for a couple of years, we had nearly 2/3 beneficiaries living on the farm compared with 1/3 pests. And the other two farms were overloaded by pest load. And it really starts to make me think about how do we get this balance going forward. Next slide, please. We've also been involved in a number of other trials run by Assist and other organisations, to looking at what is the benefit to our farming system by having an ecosystem service across the landscape. And control in this trial was a 5-year trial, and it's still actually ongoing. Business as usual, a typical farm landscape, very little habitat, a typical farm with some edges of fields done, but on those bigger fields, there was gaps in the middle. And then treatment 3, a lot of their research showed a lot of the creepy crawlies could travel around 20 to 60 to 80 meters. So if you had a habitat every roughly 100 meters, that really joined up our landscape. Next slide, please. And then, so what we found on treatment 2, there was a net gain yield of 16.3%, having that habitat around the outside. So that was traditional, in my mind, that's the traditional stewardship kind of options. Back a slide, that's it. The traditional stewardship options. And that's great on small fields, because you just do a little bit around the outsides. But on those big, typical arable fields, I'm in Cambridgeshire, and we have some quite large fields, there's no benefit into the middle. And you'll see on treatment 3, by putting those strips in, we're up to nearly 18% net yield benefit, reducing my costs and seeing an increased yield across the farm. So next slide, please. So I've taken that learning and understanding and redesigned my farm landscape, and we're just entering into new schemes. And I don't know if you can just about see on there, our biggest machine is 30 meters, our fertilizer sprayer, our spreader and sprayer. So we've subdivided all the fields down to 90s and 120s, and then we've added those awkward corners and misshaped bits of field into habitat, and that is all interconnected across our farm landscape, maximising the return for biodiversity, maximising the return for my pocket, but also food production within that, and greatly reducing my need for pesticides across the farm. Next slide, please. I think that was the last. And then I'll hand over and I'll welcome questions for later. So thank you very much. Lottie, are you there?
Patrick is a farmer and naturalist from West Thorpe in mid-Suffolk. His family-owned farm and contracting business and farm diversification projects. The family farm is a leaf demonstration farm, an AHDB strategic farm, and they are past winners of both the Farmers Weekly Countryside Farmer of the Year and FWAG Silver Lapwing Award. The family business also takes on farming and environmental contracting and farm wildlife consultancy. Conservation is integral to the farm, and they have a countryside stewardship higher tier scheme, and Patrick's ethos is to farm in modern productive ways while having a farm full of wildlife. He is the lead farmer for the recently created High Suffolk Farm Cluster. He is also a BTO licensed bird ringer and ringing trainer, and a past area coordinator of the Suffolk Community Barn Owl project. project. And Patrick is a regular contributor to the farming and environmental issues on TV and radio, in the written press, and was recently featured in the Saving Our Wild Isles documentary. So I'll hand over to you now, Patrick, for your presentation.
Thank you, Lottie. As introductions go, that was almost as long as how long I'm going to talk for, I think. But glad we got that one in. Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. Yes, I'm Patrick Barker, and I sit on the England steering group of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And hopefully, I'm going to share my screen. Can someone tell me what they can see?
We can't see anything just yet.
Okay. Have we got that?
Nope, still.
Okay.
Yeah, it's up now.
Okay. So I'm going to try and rattle through what is a 20-minute presentation in 10 minutes. So just bear with me if I start rattling through slides quicker than you can see them, because we've got a lot to fit in. So we are what I would regard as a proper farm, and everyone has their own definition of what a proper farm is, but we are in mid-Suffolk, although we're fairly close to Norfolk. We are 550 hectares growing predominantly winter wheat at the moment, so 2/3 of the farm is in winter wheat at any one time. We then have oilseed rape, spring barley and spring beans as our break crops. Our best break crop and the best one for everything that we do and we're trying to do is Herbage ryegrass. So we have around 180 acres of ground in growing Herbage ryegrass at any one time, and the ryegrass is brilliant for our soil health. It's brilliant for our rotation, our ability to grow wheat after it, and also it gives us a green cover on the farm at a time when the whole landscape turns brown. So grey partridges, barn owls, brown hares, everything absolutely has a brilliant food source. You know, when the whole landscape is cereal stubble. We are trying to run this farm in a way that we, you know, we make as much money as possible. We are trying to do it in a way where we actually look at every single cost. We're reducing our all our input costs as much as we possibly can, and we're doing it under the backdrop of having been in a 10-year HLS scheme, followed by a 5-year countryside stewardship higher tier scheme, and this January we've just started another countryside stewardship higher tier scheme with the target species that you can see on the screen. Our main target species for all our schemes have been grey partridges and great crested newts, and if we get the habitat right for those two species, then we kind of are able to benefit everything else. For us, it's all about taking our natural habitats and getting the absolute most out of them. And for us, we've got 48 kilometres of hedgerow, we've got 32 ponds, and 15 hectares. I'm going to get in that kind of weird mix up of acres and hectares if I'm not careful, of woodland, which is almost at the status of ancient, but not quite, because it's not quite old enough. But we then added in, when we created our stewardship scheme, we added in recreated wildflower meadows. So we also have a county wildlife site, Village Green, which is a traditional wildflower meadow, a species-rich wildflower meadow, and we used that wildflower meadow to seed new wildflower meadows as a donor site to create these wildflower meadows. And there's a picture of me doing that in that top right-hand corner. We work really hard with all these natural habitats to get the absolute most out of them. And I always say that we're trying to deliver almost a yield of wildlife. We're intensive wildlife managers, because in every year we're trying to get all these habitats so that they deliver as much as we possibly can for all farmland wildlife and all farmland wildlife that moves. So that's getting all our ponds so they're getting loads of sunlight in, lots of aquatic vegetation which comes with sunlight and clean water, working all our hedges on a rotation, whether we're coppicing, whether we're laying, whether we're leaving them well alone and getting them bigger because we want turtle dove breeding, making sure that we manage our hedges in a way that we get the maximum benefit for our farmland wildlife as well. And then lots of other little interventions that we can do, and I'm sure everyone watching will be able to do some, if not all of these things, just feeding nest boxes, creating different habitats. So you know, we've messed around with some of our watercourses and created a habitat shelf that you can see there, and leaky dams to try and change our aquatic habitat, nest boxes to get different things, different creatures breeding, and supplementary feeding as well. This is all on the backdrop of these environmental stewardship schemes and using these scheme options on what we'd regard as marginal land, and linking all these habitats together with grass margins, with hedges, new hedges, old hedges, and just trying to have a landscape that delivers for us as farmers, but also for our farmland wildlife as well. We set out originally trying to create a farm landscape that was yielding as much as we possibly could on the areas we were farming, but then at the same time, we were kind of setting aside the areas around the edges for maximum wildlife benefit. And as time has gone on, we've kind of learned and we've realized that what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a whole farm ecosystem. So we're now trying to get the areas, the arable areas that we're farming, to be actually good for farmland wildlife as well, and trying to make it so that the areas that are specifically in farmland wildlife benefit our farming system. And by that I mean it's getting all our fields, our arable fields, at a maximum level of soil health that we possibly can, so that there's huge benefit to them, but also then things like our flowering margins and our grass margins and our different areas that have flowers are there hosting our beneficial predatory insects and creating this whole farm ecosystem. We then took on one of the neighbouring farms, which is a long story and probably a webinar in itself, but this is an example of what we're able to do there. This is 30 acres of whole farm mid-tier stewardship scheme. So we've created almost an insect oasis, because all those different areas have flowers at one time or another, as in they are wildflower meadow in a bag, AB8 if you're familiar with that in the scheme, winter bird food, nectar flower mix and cultivated plots. So creating this kind of oasis of insect life, which hopefully just adds on what we're doing and creates a completely different kind of intensive insect habitat next door. So with all this, we were invited to become an AHDB monitor farm, and the AHDB monitor farm program was all about farmer-led knowledge exchange. And our remit right from the very start was, how can we benefit the landscape with as lower inputs as possible? And everything that we've done in that time has been looking at how we do that. So there's 4 projects we've got on the go at the moment. One of them is cover crops, winter cover crops, and looking at the difference of the cleanliness or the groundwater nitrate levels running out of field drains between land that has been ploughed. So we actually still have to do a bit of ploughing even just to satisfy this this project. In the middle of these two, there is overwinter stubble and then cover crops. And to cut a long story short, which I'm sure everyone hopefully knows already by now with winter cover crops, is that the winter cover crops are taking so much of the residual nitrogen out of groundwater. It's the green bits on that graph that we've been studying, and this trial has been so successful that the water companies are now actually funding farmers putting in cover crops, because they can see that the work that costs them billions of pounds taking nitrates out of drinking water, we can actually do it with overwinter cover crops. And overwinter cover crops has then led us to be able to create much more of that all year round food supply that we do for all our farmland wildlife. So everything's starting to fit together in a much more holistic way. Second project we've got on the go is these flowering margins, and looking at the impact of flowering margins around arable crops and the relationship between beneficial predatory insects and their prey. Now, this was a brilliant idea in principle, and the more we've studied this and the more we've done this study, the more we've realized we don't know and the more questions we ask. So actually, I went to this is based on the Assist project that Martin was talking about, and this project we were just looking at kind of how, if we put these areas, these wildflower margins in to fields, so we've got them around the edges of 2 fields, and we've got a central strip as well that Martin was talking about. You know, how does that relationship look like between crop pests and beneficial predatory insects? And really, we spent about the first 2.5 years trying to create metrics for success. You know, how do we determine what are good levels, what are bad levels, what's a high number, what's a low number? And then obviously the weather's very different as well, so different insects in different years do well. So there's tons and tons and tons of research available. It's all on the AHDB website. Put AHDB strategic farm East Slow Market or something like that into Google, and all this information comes up. But for us, it's about looking at how we can really start to create that whole farm ecosystem with these options that are available in schemes. Our third trial we've got on the go is, again, this is more of an example of what Martin was talking about. It's low input trials, and we were looking at spring beans and can we, how low can we go? How cheaply can we grow crops that actually generate a return? And the fascinating thing for me, more than the numbers and actually how low we could go, was the relationship in there between ladybirds and aphids, and the black bean aphids, which were just the most delicious feast for ladybirds, and pretty much every single life cycle of ladybird was out there doing the work for us. And we were able to keep those black bean aphids at sensible levels because of this kind of whole farm ecosystem approach. Now, with these flowering strips, it was all focused around benefits to cereals and oilseeds because it's the HDB and that's where the levy payers' money goes to. So I then created my own project off the back of this, funded by the Felix Cobbold Thornley Trust. And I linked up with the Suffolk Naturalist Society and the University of Suffolk to actually see what are the biodiversity benefits of putting flowering strips around fields. What wildlife, which species, what all these things, what can you draw into your farm? And we did that. We spent all of last summer basically monitoring what was there, and we recorded 278 species of moths, butterflies, dragonflies, mammals, birds, all the things that move. Everything that moves was recorded over 8 visits. It was supposed to be 10, but the people I had, my friends who were doing the research actually had COVID 1 week, so we only did 8 weeks. There's a few things we learned that actually, if you bring flowering margins and flowered areas into your farm landscape, you just get a ton of wildlife. And for some people, that should be enough. For me, that's the best thing about it. There's also all those other benefits that we're talking about with beneficial predatory insects. For me, rebunting's coming back and breeding on the farm off the back of these margins was brilliant, because they're a species that generally disappears off somewhere else to breed. We found meadow pipit breeding, the first time we ever found meadow pipit. We learned that hares and deer, every time they see a trail cam, they basically just put their ears up and smile. And just the moths and the butterflies, it just was absolutely off the chart. And then the sun came out and stayed out, and the flowers started to wilt away. So we kind of had a bit of a quick end to it, because at one point I think it was 40 degrees in the end of July, early August. So we didn't quite get the longevity of the flowers that we wanted to, but in real time and in a real year's conditions, these should be able to push flowers right the way through until maybe kind of September, October. I put the tractor on there as well, because actually when I'm trying to sell this to farmers, I think we made 70 odd bales of hay off the back of all our flowering areas as well, which we kind of generated a decent return, as well as everything that was going on. Butterflies and moths, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep talking. Because the researchers I had had COVID, I had a bit of money left over from the project budget, so I invited a friend who's a bee expert to come out, and he did some bee surveys, and that was something that I hadn't anticipated recording in this year of this project. But the day that he came out was just an absolute wash of bees. It was fantastic, and I learned a hell of a lot as well. Melita trachinta is a species that I think has been recorded in Suffolk kind of 4 times. Has never been recorded in East Suffolk. So to find them using our flowering strips was brilliant as well, and all the other species that you can see on there. And this all kind of fits in when I talk about the whole farm ecosystem. For me, data recording is really important, because if we're getting everything right, pushing our costs down as much as we can, and we've got a farm that's full of wildlife, this will have a value in the future. And we talk about biodiversity offsetting, we talk about, Martin mentioned ecosystem services. If you can't demonstrate it's there, how can you say to someone, we deserve to be rewarded for this because of this? So one of the things that I work really hard at is getting all these records, getting them in, submitting them all to the county recorders and the Suffolk Biodiversity Information Service, and every other project. We have pretty much an open door policy on projects. If someone says, can we, I say yes. So I've got all the University of Suffolk students coming out next week to kind of look and start thinking about what they want to write their dissertations on. They've got a free run over the whole farm to measure a lot of these species that are there. But for me, it's about showing people, if you build it, they will come. If you create a farm landscape that is beneficial to all of our farmland wildlife, it will respond and it will recover. And you know what? We actually have a farm that kind of is doing everything right. We're here, we're making money. I would say to people that this way of farming for us is good for our bank balance, it's good for our carbon footprint, it's good for our farmland biodiversity, it's good for us as well, because we absolutely love doing it. People skip to work, and there's nothing not to like about what we do. I'm going to rattle through this one as well. Do watch the Wild Isles, watch the legacy films, watch the Saving Our Wild Isles on BBC iPlayer, because we're on there, and also Neil Heseltine is another really good nature-friendly farmer from Yorkshire is on there as well, showing what is possible. We've also linked up, and Lottie mentioned the cluster, let's get all the neighbours doing it. Let's get this way of farming out over a wider landscape. And I'm delighted that Nestle have been able to fund us setting up a farm cluster to try and expand what we do and get everyone else doing it as well. I've gone over time. I can only apologise. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we look forward to questions.
Great, thank you for that, Patrick. Really, really interesting and amazing to see how much wildlife you've managed to encourage back on your farm, not just your beneficial insects. So our final talk of the night is from Rachel Richards from the organisation BugLife. So Rachel is an ecologist and naturalist working as a beelines officer for BugLife. She was a family who are dairy farmers in Lancashire and grew up in Shetland, helping out on an island croft. In recent years, she has worked for Ferroscience in York, assessing CS options on farms in the northeast of England. She represents BugLife in her current works with the NFFN farm wildlife and volunteer monitoring of farm wildlife, and has been inputting into the development of the new elms, providing advice and guidance on how best to support invertebrates, especially pollinators on farms. Rachel is a keen botanist, bird watcher and amateur entomologist who is passionate about working with farmers and other landowners to manage sites for invertebrates whilst balancing other priorities. So Rachel, I'll hand over to you and hopefully you can share your screen.
Hi, my camera's not working, but I'm here. Just 1 minute and I will share my screen. I wasn't sure if you were putting it up. Just coming. Is that working?
Yeah, we can see that.
Brilliant, fantastic. So I'm Rachel Richards, I'm Beelines Officer for BugLife. And I love those last two talks, fantastic to see how much is happening on farms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about supporting pollinators and other invertebrates on farms. So a little bit on the value of invertebrates, pollination and the need for a diversity of invertebrates, what farmers can do, and a little bit on beelines. So the value of invertebrates, obviously they have their own intrinsic value, and we love seeing the first bumblebees of the year, the various butterflies that come out, but they also provide ecosystem services which are extremely important to farming. So the enhanced pollination services, integrated pest management that we're talking about a lot here, food for other wildlife, they're the base of the food chain, and so many of the bird species that have declined are insect eaters as insects have declined, but also to the soil, so they're improving nutrient cycling, water use efficiency and aeration of soil, and then the need for less inputs because of that. Of course, we know pollination is hugely important, and 8 out of 10 wild plants need insect pollinators. And 1 in 3 mouthfuls of the food that we eat require pollination. And obviously there's a huge monetary value to that as well. Just a few crops there in terms of how they depend on insect pollinators. So fruits and beans, tomatoes, strawberries, a lot of crops there that require that insect pollination. Of course, insect pollination isn't just about the bees, isn't just about the honeybees. I know lots of people on this call are very knowledgeable already, but we have around 270 species of bee in the UK. 250 of those are solitary bees, over 2,000 butterflies and moths, almost 7,000 species of flies, 4,000 beetles. And although, you know, we think of the bees as the very efficient pollinators, if you think about the quantity, the abundance and diversity of other insects that are visiting plants, they're also helping with pollination and other services, the pest control. So while pollinators increase yields, they increase crop production and stability, even things like the oil content in oilseed rape, and they improve the size, the shape and the flavour of things like apples. So we have at least 4,000 species that help with pollination in the UK. 24 species of bumblebee. There are 2 fairly recently gone extinct, and 1 which is being reintroduced. And they can visit twice as many flowers per minute as honeybees. They're bigger, they do longer foraging trips, they're very resilient to sort of cold, wet temperatures as well, so they're adapted to our climates. And bumblebees do something called buzz pollination, which many plants, things like blueberries and tomatoes require to be pollinated. Some solitary bees can do this as well, but not honeybees. So 250 species of solitary bee, just in terms of thinking about what they need when you're thinking about them in farmland. Many of them are ground nesters, so they like bare areas of soil. Some are aerial nesters, the ones we accommodate when we put bug hotels together, but they would normally grow in beetle holes in wood or in hollow stems of plants. So things like cut brambles is valuable nesting habitat. When they carry their pollinates on their back legs or under their body in quite a messy way, so as they move between flowers, they do a lot of pollination. And hoverflies, 275 species of hoverfly in the UK, very varied groups. Some of them are big and bright, some of them are tiny little black things. Many of them are very generalist, so they'll visit a large number of different plants, and many also feed on aphid larvae. So around 40 species in the UK do predate aphids, scale insects, plant lice, so all those species that can become pests. I don't tend to think of beneficial and pest species, but it's more if you have too much of something that it can become a pest. So it's keeping that balance of invertebrates and a diverse assemblage of invertebrates so that they keep the balance of the species that could become pests. So marmalade hoverfly, which is one of the migratory species. Hoverflies do huge migrations. There are species that come right across Europe into the UK. They'll move north in about 4 generations and then 1 generation moving south again, though some are more residential. But then they're spreading pollen as they travel, and the larvae are predating things like aphids. So as we all know, there have been huge declines in much of our biodiversity, and a lot of that stems from insect declines as the base of the food chain. So more than 2/3 of pollinating insects in the UK are in decline. 6 bumblebee species have declined by at least 80% in the last 50 years, and 2 gone extinct. And similarly with butterflies, 76% of butterfly species have declined in abundance or occurrence or both in the past 60 years. So they are in trouble. Even more widespread common species are declining in abundance. And why is that? Well, as I'm sure you know, a lot of it is loss and fragmentation and degradation of habitat. 3 million hectares of wildflower-rich grassland has been lost since the 1930s. So everything we can do to put habitat back into farmlands is beneficial to the farm and to the species that require it and that benefit the farm. Pesticides is also another huge issue, and it's been seen to impair navigation and learning and reduce colony growth and queen production and affect immunity. So bumblebee colonies exposed to neonicotinoids were seen in research to send out more workers who carried out longer foraging bouts and brought back less pollen less frequently. So basically you've got a bumblebee nest, the queen produces lots of workers, to then produce at the end of the season new queens. So the more workers bringing in the more food, the more new queens will be produced, which then overwinter and come out in the spring to do the same job again. So if that nest doesn't produce many workers and many queens, you know, that there's not much the next year, you're going to have a decline the following year. So what can farmers do? In the previous 2 talks, you've already seen a lot of the things that our farmers are doing, but I'm going to go through a few basic things. So those weedy corners are really important. So leaving areas unmanaged with ruderals, things like teasels and thistles, bristly ox tongues, willow herbs, umbellifers. So those are the food, the pollen and nectar resources for many pollinators, but also, you know, foliage for other invertebrates. But those tussocky grasses, those areas that are left to grow a bit long, they provide shelter for things like grasshoppers, beetles, and lots of bumblebees. Things like common carder nest in those tussocks as well. You might want to manage them some years, so maybe leave them for a couple of years and cut a section on rotation so it doesn't turn into scrub and woodland. But that's really valuable habitat for invertebrates and so much other wildlife. And then what about, you know, where they're nesting, giving bees a home? So as I mentioned earlier, lots of bees are ground nesting. You can see a cliff face there. So if you have a southern aspect, anywhere from east to west where it's catching the sun, you'll often find solitary bees, wasps, beetles nesting. So these are some, on the left there, there's a natural feature in sheep pasture, a little cutting that the sheep often make. With the right orientation, that will be nesting habitat. So looking for those features on your farm and looking after them, maybe making them bigger or keeping them from scrubbing over, or you can create bee banks. So there's a new bee bank there and below one that's been established for a number of years there that I visited earlier this week, that was covered in solitary bees and wasps and all sorts of other things. So that nesting habitat is very valuable and often lacking in farm habitats. The nectar flower margins that we've spoken about already, legumes are extremely popular with bees, but also if you have a wild flower mix that mimics or uses green hay or local seed from your area, you've got those native plants that are going to support your native pollinators. And if it's flowering from spring to autumn, even better. But very importantly, try and keep that area chemical free, so it's a clean, healthy environment for pollinators and as long lived as possible. So ideally that would be as permanent as possible within your rotation, but taking a cut off, a hay cut at the end of the year, so the nutrient level is staying low. Wildflowers like that low nutrient environment, so you're removing the cuttings as you would with a hay cut or grazing. Disturbed areas. So again, this sort of sandy soil, you've got the open areas for basking and for nesting. That's very valuable to a lot of bees and butterflies, and also the ruderal plants that come up. Hedgerows and trees, we've mentioned them briefly, but managing them on a 2 to 3 year cycle or longer. So you have that flowering and fruiting. Obviously with birds, some birds like tall hedges, others like shorter. So a combination can work well, but having those spring flowering shrubs is really important for pollinating insects. And again, in the autumn, things like ivy as well. And leaving dead wood, so both in the sun and in the shade. And those are slightly different habitats for different invertebrates. Wet areas. So wet areas are extremely important, and a lot of hoverfly larvae are nesting in these wet areas, but having some sort of buffering so you're keeping them as clean as possible from chemicals or runoff. It's a very valuable habitats. So what to consider, you can do some sort of an assessment of your farm in terms of, I'm sure many of you have done, looking at what you have in terms of permanent habitats. On the Farm Wildlife website, you can look at the 6 key actions that cover a lot of this as well. But look at the connectivity of semi-natural habitats across your farm. Things like hedgerows, scrub, margins, ruderals, ditches, ponds, which we haven't mentioned as well. Look at the foraging availability through the season. Do you have things from spring to autumn, right through the year? You have flowers available. Nesting habitat, do you have any bare areas where things are nesting? Could you create something? Could you create more? Are those nesting habitat close to resources? A lot of small solitary bees will only travel 200-300 meters. Look at the species that are known to be in your area, what their requirements are, and see if you can accommodate them as well. And then management practices, looking at reducing that use of chemicals. Spatial context, the structure. So within a meadow, having bare areas, having hummocks, having scrub as well, so that the more diversity, invertebrates love heterogeneity. So within a very intense farming system, that's lacking. So it's putting that back in wherever you can. And the key word there, connectivity as well. So in bug life, something that we've been working on for the last 10-15 years, and we've just finished mapping the UK, is bee lines. So bee lines are corridors, 3-kilometre wide corridors that we've mapped. It's been a data-led exercise working with Liverpool University, looking statistically at where the best remaining flower-rich habitats are, so looking at designated sites, river corridors, but then sitting down at the table with people from each county, each region of the UK, people who know the land, so local landowners, NGOs, local authorities, and then mapping out where these bee lines should go. So within those 3-kilometre wide corridors, it's not solid habitat. Obviously, there's lots of other life going on, but it's trying to have stepping stones of flower-rich habitat across those bee lines. So much of that is there, but we're creating and restoring areas between that, working with lots of different organisations, farmers included, to try and connect up for pollinators so they can move through the landscape, because many invertebrates do not travel very far. So you can add what you're doing on your farm onto the beelines map. So if you go onto Bug Life on our website, under our work and beelines, scroll down, you'll find this map that you can zoom in, use that add site button and just add on anything that you're doing in your farm: wildflower margins, meadows, hedgerows that are managed for pollinators, bee banks. Just add that on and encourage others to do the same, particularly if your farm is within bee lines, but even outside of bee lines. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. That was really interesting. So we'll move on to the panel discussion section now, where we'll get to answer some of your questions. Just a couple to start off with. So Martin and Patrick, I think you may have touched on this a little bit, but how long has it taken you to build your populations of beneficial insects back up after you made the changes to your farm system?
Shall I first? I'm not sure is one answer, but on the land we've taken on over the last few years on other farms, I look to do it over about a 3-year period, because you need to create the habitat, manage it well, and then let that species have a life cycle that builds the numbers up. And then I can use that as a reliable tool for my pest management.
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer the same question with pretty much the same answer, in that we actually really don't know. What I do know is that the species that we have on the farm that is the most reliant on insects as chick food is grey partridges. It took us 9 years to get our grey partridge population, so we actually got it, so it was where we consider booming, and that was us moving from 2 pairs to probably, I think, about 22 pairs over a 10-year period. But everything came together. The whole high level stewardship scheme matured in 2018. Everything came right, and all of a sudden, bang! It was there. For me, species like all the butterflies have just increased gently over time, and I think the more we can link this all together, the more it's more of a gradual process rather than something that just appears. And then if we have a good year, a bad year weather-wise, if we have a wet year, a cold year, early spring, cold spring, you know, the numbers go up and down. So it's just kind of being in tune with the natural environment, and there's no right or wrong. There's no kind of metrics. That's what we've learned. It's just, is everything out there? Is it in balance? And are we proud of what we're doing? That's kind of how I would look at it from a farming point of view.
Yeah, that's great. Rachel, kind of one for you. What do you see as the key changes that farmers could make to their farm that would help improve the insect biodiversity? I mean, you've touched on creating those different habitats. Is there any one of those that you would consider to be the kind of key thing that they could do straight away? You still there, Rachel?
Sorry, I was answering, but I wasn't unmuted properly.
Okay.
So yeah, I think the wildflower strips, but making them as permanent as possible and as chemical free as possible. But also, it depends on the farm, the geography of the farm, but wet features as well are hugely beneficial. Managing those hedgerows better, and maybe even adding species to the hedgerow as well. If it's entirely hawthorn, for example, get other things in there. So I don't think there's one thing, but getting those flower rich habitats and cutting down on the chemical inputs.
And kind of for all the panelists, we've got one here that Patrick's mentioned that kind of answered a bit, but what kind of species do you have in your flowering strips that you see as kind of being the key features of those flowering strips?
When we looked at this as a project, the HDB were really keen to replicate the Assist project, which was quite a set. And then they decided that was actually far too expensive, so they couldn't do that. They then wanted us to recreate our flowering margins the way we created our wildflower meadows with green hay, and we decided that would take too long. So in the end, we just basically went to I think in Moorsgate with the seed provider at the time, and it was just a really nice mixture of everything. So everything that we would expect to find in the wildflower meadows, lots of different grasses. I will rattle through a few if anyone's interested. I think the lists that we have in ours are published on the HDB website, which I'll put the link in a couple of the answers to questions. but we're looking kind of at common bent crested dog's tail, red fescue, chewing fescue, smooth stalk meadowgrass for the grasses, yarrow, knapweed, wild carrot, field scabious, pretty much everything that you would expect to see in a wildflower meadow, but making sure that we've got thicker areas, we've got thinner areas, we've got tusky grass, so that it's really good small mammal habitat, but also at the same time we've got really nice lush green grass, so the small mammals have got something to eat. We want flowers that sit up high, so that the insects can land on them, but also we want flowers that flower really close to the ground, so that there's insects on them, because the grey partridge chick, when it hatches, is you know, 1.5 inches tall, and they need to be able to access insects on the ground. So it's just about having variety, and I think it's sometimes it's been described as the rainforest effect. It's kind of delivering at every height for every species. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just making sure that all that variety is there that benefits everything.
Does anybody else want to come in on that, or has Patrick comprehensively covered it?
I'll just add on that many of the species that we have on our margins are benefiting biodiversity. What I'm trying to learn is which species of flowers host the most predatory insects and which ones host the pests, because I don't want to go and put a load of things in that tip the balance the wrong way. And actually there's very little research around that. So if I've got a lot of sugar beet or maize or one sort of crop, which kind of mix of species do I want to put in my margins? And if I've got a lot of beans, oilseed rape and cereals, what do I need in that? And we could do that in different parts of the country, because you can understand the pest load, and we just need some more research in understanding in what could we put in that really adds to biodiversity, but underpin, helps support the cropping system we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. How does the biodiversity of the edges and the margins reflect in the middle of the crop? So is the crop itself a good habitat, or do you see it as the edges or those strips that you put within the field?
I'll go then. The centre of the fields are more monocropped because it's a predominantly a crop of wheat, a crop of beans. Some are multi-species. We might have oats and beans. We might have an understory of weeds still growing there. So the real benefit is the biodiversity areas, but there is life living right across the farm landscape. In our fields, it's full of beetles, they're full of mice, voles, and all sorts of other stuff. So it's not a dead zone. It's just a productive zone that's got more of one species of crop growing, rather than more of those diverse areas which are in the margins.
Yeah, I think we all know the answer to that. It's the right question to ask, but the reality is that it is still a farmed landscape as well. And if we're going to call ourselves farmers, then we actually need to be growing crops. There's not going to be the variety in the middle of the field that there is on the edges, but that's not to say that there isn't anything there. A spring bean crop is going to be very different to a wheat crop. I know that our wheat crops, there'll be skylarks nesting in the middle, whereas the spring beans, there'll be ladybirds through the entire crop. What we've actually been able to show from the project I did, that a lot of these species want to be close to the hedgerows. They want to be close to the margins, just because it's actually safer. And if we can start linking all these habitats together, then we benefit all those species together. And it's just, I think we always have to kind of remind ourselves that it is the farmed landscape, and I don't mean that in a negative. It's we do have to be able to deliver everything over the whole landscape, otherwise it's a nature reserve.
Yep, good point. We've got a question here about are there any courses out there to help farmers ID plants and insects on their own farm? So I don't know whether Rachel, you know of any, or Patrick.
The Field Studies Council are really good. There's lots of courses that the Field Studies Council run that people can go out and get involved with. The way I've done it is I've literally gone out there and learned it. There's some brilliant phone apps and there's some awful phone apps, but if you take a phone app and you have an insect or a plant, if you then overlay it against the distribution and the likelihood, probably gets you to the right answer in the end. There's no substitute for just looking, listening, asking, and remembering. Remembering's the hard bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of good Facebook groups as well. So the Bee Wars group for bees and wasps, the hoverfly group, and on those, you can take a photo and share it. It's great if you have a go yourself, get a book and have a go at looking things up, but the Facebook groups are very helpful. I don't know about courses designed specifically for farmers, but as you say, there's a lot of FSC courses.
No, that's really interesting. We've got quite a few questions on what both Martin and Patrick, what you're doing to improve soil biodiversity on your farms.
Yeah, so it's a sympathetic approach to soil with everything we're trying to do. It's about having the right rotation, having a wide rotation and a varied rotation. So the ground that we have here, Martin and I probably have a competition. All farmers think they've got the heaviest land. We've got heavier land than that Cambridgeshire land. So this is all land that grows really good cereals. So that's what we're trying to do. But we're making sure that we've got pulses, we've got flowering crops, we've got herbage ryegrass, as I said, in our rotation. So making sure the rotation rests the soil and adds goodness to it, adds nutrients to it. Then at the same time, the overwinter cover crops are actually effectively, it's basically we're growing our own compost because we can't get compost. We don't have muck anymore. We are growing our own compost to try and add soil biodiversity, to aerate the soil, all those things that Martin's talked about. We're doing that from a bag. Then it's not disturbing the soil, so it's direct drilling as much as we possibly can. People say to us, are you a regenerative farmer? Are you a min till, this till, that till, zero till? And I say we use the most appropriate technique for the crop, the soil, and the conditions that we think, but we do as little as possible all the time. So it's it's a multi strategy approach, but it all comes down to trying to get nature to do as much as we can for us, I think, is the way we would look at it. And that's using soil, using water, using sunlight, and using our soil biodiversity to assist us rather than us kind of working against it and affecting it.
I'll just add on that, we're a lot of the same. We're 65% clay content in our soil. That's how I define our heavy soil. So add as much diversity into our cropping system, into our cover crops. We've reintroduced livestock back into the system, grazing our cover crops. We've got herbal lays going in, so we've got rest periods. We're bringing in compost and manures wherever possible, and building facility up from the bottom instead of applying from the top. And just looking at a more sympathetic way of what nature can do with us first. Focusing on soil health, worm populations, using roots to cultivate soil instead of steel, and then having a diverse approach to the cropping. And then we're also using lots of technology to minimise applications, soil tyre technology, GPS, to really stop causing. We cause soil compaction within our farming operation, and we've got to minimise that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's great. We've got a couple of questions on what do you use glyphosate basically, and what do you see it, or can you explain the role of glyphosate in your farming for biodiversity, and could you do without it? And Rachel, if you want to come in on kind of how you see the role of glyphosate in these farms as well, do feel free. So
yes, I use some glyphosate. It terminates my cover crops where I need to. We've used a lot less than we ever do. We never put it on a crop that's going in human, a crop we're going to harvest. We can avoid that. They're going in the human chain. We are trying to get away from it. I've got a crimp roller on my drill. It doesn't terminate cereals or blackgrass. So we've cultivated in the spring. Last year was not the year to do that. We lost 70% of our yield because we cultivated instead of using glyphosate and then had no rain whatsoever. So I'm trying to use the right tool and minimise pesticide use as much as possible. And I hope one day I'll get to the point I won't be using it at all.
Yeah, almost exactly the same answer, probably, as you'd expect from everything that's gone before. But it is a very useful tool in our armoury. It means that we don't have to cultivate as much as we can, and in years when the ground is particularly dry or the weather isn't particularly kind from a rainfall point of view, blackgrass isn't such a problem, but we don't want to be cultivating because we're going to get it to germinate. We know blackgrass is pretty much a marshy plant, so it likes wet conditions. If we have a herbicide that we can use, then we would use it as opposed to doing anything else. But that's not to say we haven't tried pretty much everything that's Martin talking about. We've tried rolling cover crops, we've tried grazing them, all these different things, and it's just trying to, you know, I think we almost have to say that when I do these things with the general public, actually, less so than farmers groups like this, it's kind of reminding people that it's expensive and it's damaging, and actually it's time consuming as well to use products. So we're trying to do that as least as we can all the time, but that doesn't mean that we don't use it where we think we need it.
Yeah, I think obviously I don't have the experience of having to use it. You know, in an ideal world, we wouldn't use it at all. So it's really just the research and the experience of the farmers in how to minimize the use of it wherever possible. And it's remembering, you know, it doesn't just affect those the target plants, it affects other plants and other invertebrates as well. So it's just keeping it to a minimum, and yeah, continuing to research new techniques of managing without it, and keeping those costs down as well, of course.
And we've got a question here. What would you say to farmers with large land holdings and massive fields who don't want to incorporate the wildflower margins? Because it seems like the margins are kind of a win-win. Do you guys have any comments on what you would say to them to encourage them to take up wildflower margins?
What we always say is we're not here to tell people what to do. We're here to show people here we have a way that actually works, that has a whole number of different benefits and a range of different benefits. I think people who are reluctant, maybe they need to bore down and actually work out their cost of production. They need to look at their farm in more detail and see actually what is generating yield in the old-fashioned sense, in a crop sense, and what isn't. And then how does that work against stewardship payments? How does that work against money that's available from the private sector? Because actually, I challenge anyone who's got a hedge like Martin's got in his background there, the shady side, the north side of that hedge isn't going to be growing 10 tonne a hectare wheat, and I'm sure you can get a much better return in any stewardship option than you can with trying to force wheat 1 metre from the ditch in the shady bit. You know, it's all about actually the economics of what is the best and the most appropriate land use. And for some people, it's farming every inch. I think hopefully there's a movement away from this, and I think people are starting to realise that actually there are other alternatives out there which have a range of benefits. And this will come from farmers, it will come from the accountant, it'll come from the bank manager when they start asking awkward questions, but also it's going to come from the general public as well. And you know, we know what we do. Actually, the general public appreciate it. The people who live around here, they love going out and seeing all the wildlife. They walk the field, they walk the footpaths. Most of the time they probably walk the fields as well. I meant to say footpaths, but they probably do walk the fields. You know, it's kind of making sure that as land managers, we're doing everything right. But if we're not making money and we're not being efficient, then chances are we're not going to be here to do it for the long term. And as we move into a world with no BPS, I think these questions will become more and more apparent.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's the monetary side of it, but there's the other benefits that something like a hedgerow brings in terms of soil erosion, you know, protecting your soil on your farm that you need to farm, but also as well as business people, you know, we're custodians of the earth and looking after it and keeping it in a good condition and creating countryside that is full of wildlife that we and others and the next generation can enjoy. And you know, insects and a lot of things are in decline, abundance and diversity, and if there's no habitat for them within the farm landscape, that's just going to continue, isn't it? So you know, we all need to do our bit, however big or small that we can.
I'll just add, those that may not want to transition yet, I think they may be encouraged to by supply chains and consumers. Many of our pesticide products will be taken away. We increasingly recognise some are causing long-term harm, and we just need to find new practices and new ways to go forward. But also, many of us are recognising, and I think we need to help other farmers recognise, nature should be a stakeholder in our business. And if we get the balance right, it actually underpins and gives us increased output, and then we can get some reward for those habitats and other bits as well. And it's just refocusing the future farming system that balances outcomes society wants. We need food, we need nature, we need climate mitigation, all being rewarded and balanced across the farm landscape.
So we've just got somebody here that was wanting to know kind of what percentage of the annual farm income comes from the kind of ag payments, and going forward, how do you see as kind of, either using elms and then perhaps even being able to wean ourselves off some of the payments but continue improving nature friendly farming? Is that something that we think is viable in the long term, that we can actually get to a stage where we don't need the payments in order to be viable businesses?
So for my business model, we've been a tenant. We've always had an additional charge under the tenancy because of the BPS. We've disconnected that. I pay a productive rent, and the BPS goes to my landlord. So I've been already farming without it for a long time. It's actually been a burden to my business because we've paid the landlord the value of the BPS before it's been paid back into our account from the RPA. Where in other models, on our own farm at home, we've been trying to farm without it. So we're using stewardship and other income streams to underpin the delivery of and maximising the return across the whole farmed field. We know we've got areas of the field that aren't the best production for food, for growing a ton of wheat, yet I can earn more money putting habitat on. And within our scheme and our, as we go forward, under our countryside stewardship schemes, we're going to be earning more money going forward with the countryside stewardship and the SFI options than we were under the BPS. We can bring significant other money in, and then we're also getting capital grants coming in for roadways, livestock fencing, spaced or filling areas, washdown facilities, and all the other stuff I need to do in my business as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, because I think this is coming whether people like it or not. You know, this isn't, oh, are we going to lose our subsidies? This is 2028, it's gone. So actually every single day since not everyone, was it 51% of people voted Brexit? We've been kind of mapping this out and planning for it, knowing this was coming, and we have to have businesses that run in the black without a subsidy. Otherwise, we're not going to have businesses. So it's about looking at all those other business pressures, all those other alternative income streams, making sure that we're farming in a way that every single year is in the black. Otherwise, there's no annual bailout anymore, and that it's not going to be there. You know, this is very much something that is coming. Everyone needs to get their head around it, and you know, hopefully, as the Nature Friendly Farming Network, we can show there's a way that we think this will work. You know, we're just trying to balance together profitable businesses, food production, natural resources, wildlife, biodiversity management, all those sort of things, and like I said earlier, hopefully there's ways that we can show that this does work. I'm probably not going to advertise our farm accounts probably too widely, but I can tell you that we're still here and we're going to be here next year, and this is a system that works for us.
And what do you see as kind of the role of private sector financial investment in these kind of discussions? Do you see that as something that's only going to help with encouraging people to move this way into this kind of increasing? Yeah. I think somebody was wanting you to talk a bit more on that, Patrick, because obviously you've had Nestle help setting up a farmer cluster, so I think that was around what people were wanting to hear you talk about. I
was in London at 5 o'clock. I've been at Nestle's head office at Gatwick, and they did a showing of Hungry for Change, the Wild Isles legacy film about food and farming, for all their staff in the UK, which I think is something around 2,000 people. There's a company there, and Nestle's the one I know about. Other companies are doing good things as well, but they are looking at the products they buy from farmers. So they're very much invested in the cereal supply chain and also milk in the northwest, looking at how they can deliver a countryside and farmland that provides them with the cereals that they need, which is wheat, barley and oats, but also supporting farmers to be in a very or down a regenerative route or environmentally conscious about what they're doing, helping them deliver a net zero supply chain for their products, but also supporting farmers to do the good work that actually necessarily doesn't always have a monetary value. So there's a scheme, the scheme that we funded our cluster through is called LENS, which is Landscape Enterprise Networks, which is a whole number of companies. There's Cargill, there's some of the water companies, Affinity Water, Anglia Water, are all coming together to actually push private money into the farming sector and looking for ways in which they can actually do good to invest in the natural environment. I think we are getting close to, and I think we're going to be in a position where if any farms, any landowners want to do work that benefits the natural environment, they're not ever going to have to pay for it themselves again. I think that money will always be there. If you want to plant hedges, if you want to restore ponds, if you want to put in wildflower margins or meadows or wherever it might be, the money is out there. You've just got to look for it. and that is there to underpin businesses to still do what they do to produce food, but the products that have monetary value or don't have a monetary value, there will be assistance to fund that. I haven't explained that very well at all, I apologise. But the private sector is looking at this, and there's huge benefits to them, and I think we should all be in a position where we can take advantage of it, and by that I mean we can use that money to do good work and create a better, a healthier, a more balanced natural environment at the same time.
Martin or Rachel, do you want to come in on that as a point, or?
There is significant money to flow in. We just don't want the greenwash, and we need standardisation and baseline recording to know that we're showing additionality or delivery, whether that's coming from the private sector or the public sector. I just think we all recognise nature and carbon outputs from our landscape need increasing, and we can deliver solutions. And to get those solutions, we need funding in to do that at pace. And many of private and public funding streams are doing that.
So then we have a question which is quite popular, which is for you, Martin and Patrick, really. It's, have you considered renting 2-acre parcels of your land for organic market gardens at peppercorn rates to allow footholds into food production for younger, passionate people who don't have that kind of obvious route into farming?
It's something I'm looking at, because if I'm taking 1-2 hectares out to put a flower margin in, or a birdseed plot because it's the awkward shape of a field or something, if there isn't someone who wants to try and do something, how do I assist them? We've already got someone who brings some bees in, we've already got a shepherd who comes and puts his sheep on the farm. It's how can I look at engaging, but they will need infrastructure, water, some sort of shed. How can we allow that and have planning that works for that as well?
The model in the question that you've asked, the answer is no, and I don't want to give away the secrets of my next venture, but we will always look at every opportunity that's out there that is has cost benefit, has money to be made, or there's public benefit, or there's social benefit, or there's educational benefit. I think in this area where we are, that there's no demand for that. Everyone has a garden, and we're lucky that where we are, that's the situation. But I've got other projects where you could change some of those words around, which we're looking at implementing pretty soon, that would have exactly the same educational and social benefit, doing slightly different things. So yes and no is the answer to that.
So we've got we're getting towards the tail end of questions, really. So one, just as a kind of perhaps slightly more controversial question, do the panel ever see us getting to a stage where we might be pesticide free on farm? Do you think that's ever possible, or do you think there might always be that kind of odd instance where we need them? And in 20 years' time, do you still see yourself using pesticides?
That's two very different questions. I think insecticides we're going to have to learn to live without, because I think that's coming. I think herbicides are slightly more on the seesaw. I think if we can demonstrate as an industry that we can actually use them correctly and sensibly, and it's not influenced by people outside of farming using them badly as well, and in different ways, then probably herbicides, there is a use for them if they are used properly. And I think fungicides, we need them because we can't control the weather, and actually people still need crops and cereals and food at the end of the day, would be my take on the first question.
If the market recognised and rewarded it, and we didn't import products that had pesticide products on, I think we can get there. We do not have a level playing field, and if the UK cereal farmers stop using pesticides, and then everything that came into the UK was, we'll never compete. But I do think, well, personally, I am trying to get to the point that we minimise and we'll almost get rid of them. But if I get a year that is full of disease and I need one product to make sure that crop makes to market to feed people, I want to have that tool currently at my disposal. But I do think we can get to a really good, healthy place if we had a fair food and farming system that is standardised, that we don't undercut by importing.
What was the second part of the question?
It was sort of, do you see yourself still using pesticides in 20 years time? But I think you've sort of touched on that with the idea that yes, if that's the only way to keep the crop alive, then it seems silly not to use something then, doesn't it, if we're going to not be able to feed people otherwise?
Yeah, I think that depends what comes in the future as well. 20 years is a hell of a long time. You know, it might be we're looking at robotics is the answer to what we do, and everything is a far better way of doing it with robotics than people can. It might be that people decide that they want to eat food produced in labs or hydroponics. There's so much that can change out there. All we can really do at the moment is farm and manage the natural environment the way we can, absolutely the best we can, looking forwards with the information we have at the moment, doing the right thing, to being what I've said earlier about being proper farmers. I'm going to answer Denise's question even though you haven't asked it. Lottie, for me, a proper farmer is a farmer who's doing the right things the right way for the right reasons, and that is down to every farmer. It's almost your conscience to kind of think, you know, are we doing this in a way that is right? I just think all these farms, people should know what is the right way of doing things. How are we doing it so it benefits the natural environment, and is it good for to make business sense? Is it good for our bank balance as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add anything, and not being a farmer myself, it's not really fair for me to say, you know, what we should or shouldn't be doing. But obviously just the moving towards reducing as much as possible. But yeah, it's gonna take time and a lot of technology, especially with herbicides.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair comment. So we're basically looking at what further support might be needed to help get these resistant farmers on board. Is it just more information about the schemes that are out there? Is it more information? I know you were saying there's lots of, well, there's that kind of lack of information about which specific species you want to put in these flowering margins. Is that what you guys see as something that we need in order to get these farmers on board?
I think if someone's asking those questions, then they're kind of down the right road already. And for me, it's about making sure we've got the right scientific information out there supporting this as a principle, as an idea, and saying to people, actually, you know what, you don't need to be using the blue bag in the number, the quantity that you are, and you don't need to be putting these pesticides on your crop as an insurance policy. It's like, let's use them when we need them, not when we think we might need them. You know, it's changing that whole system, and it's breaking it down to that business level. And one thing we always say is it's about we should be moving to a world where we're talking about margin instead of yield. There's a lot of farmers who are out there thinking, oh, we need to fill that barn as full as we possibly can. How much does it cost you to grow it? No idea. Actually, it's about the margin. It's can we grow more crop or a little bit less crop for far reduced cost of production, because actually that is what drives these businesses, not the amount of wheat or the part of oilseed rape that's in the shed. So it's actually getting people to think like businessmen, and I think that is coming with the subsidies being removed as well. It depends how long you want me to talk for. I can keep going and going and going. I think joining everything together, making sure that we're looking at a whole farm ecosystem approach, so we can see the benefits to everything and how everything fits together. You know, why are we planting hedges? Well, it's because we know that we need nesting habitat, we need insect habitat. How do we get it to create an all year round food supply? It's about getting flowering margins in. It's about getting everything fitting. How do we get late nectar in the autumn? It's cover crops. It's getting our bird food right, which also benefits, which provides a nectar source in the summer and into the autumn. But then also it's providing bird food, and actually then that starts flowering in the spring early. It's how do we make everything benefit each other, and how do we join it up year round, year on year on year, so that the farm and the ecosystem can all work together. I'd also throw in there agronomists. You know, let's get these agronomists on board. There's some companies out there with agronomists who are really looking at regen ag and how do we advise farmers to use as little as possible. And there's other companies who, if they use less chemical, they're not going to get quite so much of a commission. So we need to be making sure that the agronomists are actually on board and looking at these things from the right direction as well. How do we connect all these farms together? You know, collaboration and connectivity between farms doing the right thing. All these species that we've talked about, if the way we increase their populations is by connecting habitats, getting them on one farm, the next farm, the next farm, the next farm, and getting these populations increasing rather than just having little oases of really good habitat. I've got plenty more, but I'll probably stop.
I'll just add in that peer-to-peer, bottom-up, farmer-to-farmer sharing stuff, bringing in the right technology and resource to help explain things. That, you know, that trial, that's a bit of technology that can prove that you can do it in a different way. And we know farmers in a wide range of mindsets. You've got those that are organic and up that end, and those that are very, very input minded. And how do we show everyone along that chain somebody a bit further along and help them communicate that there is a different way? Because if I show an organic farmer to someone at the bottom end, there is no change going to happen whatsoever, because they just won't connect with that. But if we can demonstrate, and that's part of what the role of the network is, that diversity of farming approaches, whether that's livestock, arable, in Scotland, in Wales, in England, we can support each other and make the whole system improve. And that peer-to-peer and bottom up with support from the top, it really can work.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking exactly the same in terms of peer-to-peer. So events like this, where farmers are showing other farmers what they've done and, you know, how it works, and especially on-farm events. So, you know, you can walk around and see what others are doing. But, you know, I think there's always going to be a percentage of farmers that aren't so interested, but there's a large number, I think, that just want more information, and it's trying to point people in the right direction to answer the questions that they have, and inform them of where they can go to find out more. Yeah.
And for me, that's the strength of this network. This is an environmental arm around farmers, saying you're not the only person here doing this. You know, there's loads of us out there who are doing it. We're doing it because we enjoy it, because it makes sense, and we know it's right. For me, it's about having a farm that's full of wildlife, but it's saying to people, you know, we actually are all in this together. And that is the strength of the Nature Friendly Farmer Network. You know, it is something it's not easy, but it's not something to be feared either.
Martin?
Well, I'll be a little cheeky. I've just seen a question in the feed. I don't know if we're going to get to it, but about heritage varieties. We used YQ last year. We did 6.5 tonne a hectare with no inputs whatsoever. And using some of those older varieties is giving me more confidence to go forward. But I'm more concerned that we're going down a road where the availability of that diverse seed mixes and some of the more traditional varieties will be restricted from us, and we can't actually trade heritage varieties between farmers. There is no way of paying a royalty. There's no way of, you have to do it quiet in the dark in the supermarket car park and swap a few tons over, because legally we're not allowed. So how do we shift that? If I've done a blended of wheats that really worked on my farm, I could share a few tons with Patrick and see if they work on his farm. And I have that ability, but we all need to pay for that breeding opportunity going forward. But I think some of what we've had in the past, the varieties, could really unlock potential going forward, particularly in a less input system.
And I just saw a comment, I think, Rachel, you'd answered it a bit. It was about, what is it that we think, because the public seem to be wanting pesticide-free foods, but there's not many people that buy organic. And don't know whether anybody wants to just quickly comment on that as kind of last thought, and then we'll take last thoughts on ecosystems in balance.
We know many customers want pesticide free or want high animal welfare and high standard in production. They go into the supermarket and they buy on price. So how do we get the supply chains, the Nestle's, the supermarkets, and even the out of house retail side and the restaurants, putting good food and good products into their system and on the plates? Because that's the only way we're going to really, because the consumer always buys on price, or the majority of them do, particularly when times are hard, or if you're a citizen who hasn't got much disposable income. So how does the state and the supply chain put the right products in the right place?
Did you want to come in on that as well, Rachel?
No, I mean, I was basically just, the same thing. It's too expensive for many people. We've got to find a way to bring the price down somehow, haven't we? Because
No, I'm sorry, we haven't got food poverty, we've got poverty. We've got citizens that can't afford to eat well, and we need to help them. If you drive down the cost of food, you put me out of business. We've got to find the way that everyone can eat well and have the income to do that.
Yeah, but there's middle ground maybe, isn't there, between the dirt cheap and the really prohibitive, expensive organic meat and veg.
If everything was organic, there wouldn't be any price difference.
So just going to ask all of you just for a kind of final thoughts on this whole ecosystem, you know, just as a sum up of the topic, really, kind of final thoughts, 30 seconds, really. Do you want to start, Martin? Then we'll go to Patrick and then to Rachel.
So if I was a farmer, go and talk to other farmers, go and see what others are doing who are already trying to take a different approach. There's lots to learn, and you have the ultimate control if you're putting a product on or doing something to do something different, even if it is only for the last few meters of a tram line, and just see what happens and build confidence within yourself.
I think we set out thinking that we could solve insect problems with insects, and actually we've developed into a way that a farm is an ecosystem, and a whole farm ecosystem fits together from a financial, from a biodiversity, from a carbon, from a welfare, from an education point of view. So it's go down this route with an open mind and look at it, how does this way of farming affect and benefit everything, rather than being too specific in thinking.
Yeah, and I think we have to look at the longevity of farming and in terms of looking after the environment that you are farming as well, and incorporating nature in that as much as you can. But yeah, find out what other farmers are doing in your area and arrange on-farm events to, you know, get more people involved with doing the same thing and developing that.
That's great. I just want to thank all of our panelists for the brilliant talks they've given and some great answers as well to all of the questions. I'd like to thank all of our attendees as well for the great questions and just coming along tonight. If you have enjoyed this webinar, we have got one on tomorrow as well as the kind of final day of our Nature Friendly Farming Week, and that's on slow the flow, farming for flood management. So please tune into that as well if you're interested. And also, just as a reminder, this recording will be available on the website and on the YouTube channel as well if you've missed anything or want to come back and have a look at it as well. We will also be sending out a resource pack at the end of this with a lot of the links to the studies that were mentioned in this, and Rachel, I'm sure, will share some of the data that they have as well at Bug Life for those of you, because I know there were a couple of questions on different resource packs and things in there, and we'll try and link to any of the apps that Martin and Patrick and Rachel find particularly useful for actually kind of either IDing plants and pests on farm, or for some of the other apps that you for monitoring apps as well. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.